In the heart of 19th century London, beneath the soot-darkened rooftops and gaslit alleys of the East End, a quiet tragedy unfolded one match at a time. This is the story of the Matchstick Girls. Young, often forgotten, and far too small for the work they were forced to endure, they lit the fires of the city while slowly being consumed by the very chemicals they handled. Tonight, we're going to take a slow walk through their world. You'll hear the soft clang of the factory bell, the shuffle of tired feet on cobbled streets, and the scratch of wooden splints dipped in poison. This is not a story of loud revolutions or kings and queens, but of quiet endurance, whispered resistance, and the price paid by the smallest hands in the empire. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let the world soften around you. Before we begin, I invite you to share something in the comments below, where you're listening from, and what time it is, where you are. We'd love to know where in the world this story reaches. Now, let's begin the journey into the smoky, silent world of London's Matchstick Girls. The sky hadn't even begun to lighten when the tenement stirred. It was somewhere around 5 in the morning, though no one had a clock to confirm it. You knew it was time to wake not by an alarm, but by the coughs from the next bed, the rattle of a kettle over coals, and the creak of floorboards above you. That, and your mother's sharp voice urging you to get up before you re-laid again and get the stick from the matron. Shoes, if you had them, were stiff and cracked. If you didn't tea, and many didn't tea, you just learned to walk quickly on cold cobbles and ignore the sting of the morning chill. This was East London in the 1880s. Crowded, noisy, always on the edge of hunger. The kind of place where the air itself seemed tired, and even the fog looked like it had given up. Rows of brick houses leaned toward each other like old men swapping gossip. Smoke hung low, clinging to your lungs before you even stepped inside the factory. You passed other girls, boys with baskets, the occasional policeman who barely looked at you. The streets were wet with last night's rain, and puddles glittered under gas lamps like broken glass. It began with frost on the windows, a shared blanket, and someone else's foot in your back. In the alleyways, rats darted from crates and broken barrels. Some had vanished entirely. Mothers worked washing clothes, sewing buttons, or scrubbing floors for people who had more money, but not necessarily more kindness. For most match girls, life was laid out like railway tracks. You got up, you worked, you came home, you slept. Maybe, if you saved a few pennies, you'd buy a ribbon. Maybe you'd catch the eye of someone kind. And the girls filed in, coughing, yawning, laughing, shivering into another long day of work. Most wouldn't return home until nightfall. Some wouldn't return at all. Maybe you'd grow old without losing all your teeth to poison. Maybe. A girl named Nell said she dreamt about having a bed of her own and a tin full of buttons. Everyone laughed. Buttons were worth a fortune to a girl with no coins. And the girls who walked to Bryant and May each day carried not just their lunch tins and matchboxes, but their own quiet resilience, a kind of stubborn fire that no amount of smoke could choke. Someone learned a song and sang it quietly on the walk to work. Someone else had found a penny in the street and planned to buy an apple after the shift. Someone offered to trade their comb for a button. The barter ended in giggles and a warning that they were nearly late. The match girls of London, little more than children, stepped into history one shift at a time. A young girl, barely 9, woke with a start and ran barefoot down the stairs, her dress clutched in one hand, bonnet half on. Her older sister yelled after her, "You'll be lucky if the matron lets you in." She cursed under her breath and followed, because leaving your sister behind wasn't something you did, not unless you wanted a full scolding from Mom. A dog barked in the distance. A man shouted something drunken and incomprehensible. All of it was background noise. This was normal. Even if it wasn't your first day, your stomach flipped a little. You could smell it before you saw it, the sharp chemical sting of white phosphorus. the very thing that made the matches light, ... and the girls sick. These girls, many of them between the ages of 10 and 16, would gradually pull on the same clothes they wore yesterday and the day before that, because they owned exactly one dress. Two if they were lucky. For the Matchstick girls of Bryant and May, the day didn't begin with dreams or breakfast in bed. The uniform was simple: a faded cotton frock, patched at the elbow, sometimes tied at the waist with a piece of string. The oatmeal was thin and gray, more of a warm idea of food than food itself. Still, it was better than nothing, and nothing was common. If you were lucky, you might get a piece of bread, dry and hard enough to scratch your gums. In a corner, someone stirred porridge with a stick. Not a spoon. Spoons went missing too often. Some girls combed their hair with their fingers. Others simply tied it back and tucked it under a bonnet. A few kept a bit of broken mirror in a tin, peering into it for a second of vanity before work stole the rest of the day. But mostly, there was no time for looking pretty. You were going to the match factory, not a dance. And the walk there, well, that was its own story. The journey to the factory wasn't far in distance, but it was long in spirit. You'd see mothers dragging children along, sometimes younger than you, wiping their noses on sleeves and yawning so wide you thought their jaws might stay open. And yet, even in the dreariness, there was chatter. Someone made a joke. Someone else groaned about her back, hurting already. The factory loomed ahead like a brick fortress. It was squat and wide, with smoke pouring from chimneys and windows black with soot. Inside, it was worse. But we'll get to that. Back in the tenement, meanwhile, someone had overslept. In many homes, fathers were absent, dead, or out looking for work. There was no luxury of choice. No dreams of finishing school, becoming a teacher, or even a seamstress. But even in that gray, coal-soaked world, there were little pockets of light. Sisters shared jokes. Girls whispered stories. The East End was many things: brutal, busy, bleak, but it was also alive. And so, by 6 a.m., the gates of the factory creaked open. But for now, the day had begun. The factory bell rang out like a church toll for the damned, echoing over the rooftops of East London, just as the sky began to pale. It wasn't a melodic chime or a gentle call to work. It was hard, metallic, and utterly without sympathy. For the girls of Bow, especially those who worked at Bryant and May's match factory, the sound signaled the beginning of another long, exhausting day. Another 14-hour shift spent breathing in the sharp, chemical scent of white phosphorus. Each morning before the sun had fully risen, the girls stirred in their beds, or in many cases bed. Whole families squeezed into a single room, with thin cotton blankets shared like secrets. Sleep was light and short. A stale piece of bread pocketed for later would have to do. His eyes flicked from the clock to the faces of the arriving girls, noting down anyone late. 3 times late meant the fine, and the fines were brutal. You could be docked for being late, for dropping matches, for talking too much, or for taking too long in the privy. There was no slack in the system, no room for mercy. You worked to the bell, and when it rang, your time was no longer your own. Time was everything. The bell did not wait, and neither did the foreman. And replacements were easy to find in the poverty of East London. A supervisor might walk the floor, eyes darting between hands and trays, checking that no one was wasting time. Talking was discouraged. Singing was forbidden. Though some girls hummed under their breath, if only to stay sane. A shared joke, a kind word, a gesture of friendship when someone was struggling. The human spirit has a way of blooming in even the worst soil, and the match girls, for all their hardship, carried something defiant in their smiles. They were not passive victims. They were survivors, fierce, clever, and capable of great courage. They might nod to the older women, or wave to a friend in another department, but voices lowered instinctively. Inside the factory walls, eyes were always watching. Not just the overseers, but also other girls, sometimes encouraged to report one another for small offenses. You got used to the smell. You got used to the aches. You even got used to the punishments. Some girls tried to rebel, refusing to pay fines or speaking out against conditions. Boots tapping on stone, eyes heavy with sleep, hands already preparing for the long day ahead. Behind those walls, their laughter would be quiet, their pain hidden, and their hours swallowed by the relentless rhythm of production. But they were silenced, either by dismissal, public shaming, or, worst of all, indifference. No one cared. There was always another girl waiting to take your place. Sometimes the girls rose even before the bell, woken by the clatter of carts, the cries of fishmongers, or the screech of coal being poured into street grates. Fires were a constant fear. One careless spark, one brush of a matchstick across the wrong surface. The girls marched to work not because they believed in it, but because they had no other choice. And everything could go up. There had been fires before. There would be fires again. But no one liked to talk about them too loudly. Slipping into worn boots and buttoning their coarse blouses, they might quietly brush their hair with fingers rather than combs. Many had no time for breakfast. Girls sat side by side, hunched over like monks, dipping sticks into trays of chemicals with practiced speed. The smell of phosphorus filled their lungs immediately, sharp, sweet, and toxic. There was the break bell, though the break was short and often unpaid. There was the lunch bell, but most could not afford more than bread and tea. Then there was the evening bell, the most sacred sound of all, that marked the end of the day's sentence. The foreman said the air wasn't harmful. The girls who'd been there longer knew better. Their teeth ached, their jaws swelled. Some had sores they dared not show. Outside, the world was a smudged sketch of chimneys and fog. The industrial air, always thick with soot, gave the mornings a dreamlike haze. The factory had rules, yes, but they had ways of ignoring them when it was convenient. Only the dreams here were rarely sweet. The streets of Bao were cobbled and uneven, and on winter mornings they could freeze like glass. Girls helped one another over puddles, giggling if one slipped, laughter being one of the few things they could afford. They were so young, some just 12 or 13, a few even younger, though official records said otherwise. As they approached the looming structure of the Bryant and May factory, the fog thinned just enough to reveal its sharp silhouette. The factory wasn't a place that welcomed you. It stood like a fortress, tall brick walls, iron gates, and rows of darkened windows that never seemed to reflect the light. Some girls whispered that it looked like a prison. Others joked that it was one only worse. Because in prison, at least you didn't have to pay for your own tools. At the entrance, a man stood with a clipboard and a pocket watch, the timekeeper. Girls filed through the gates, often in silence. Their chatter from the street faded as they passed into the shadow of the factory. Each girl wore an apron, many already stained with the yellow tint of phosphorus, and tied their hair back to keep it from catching fire. The day began with sorting. Boxes of wooden matchsticks were delivered to long communal tables. And yet, they worked. What choice did they have? The bell that started the day was not the only one they heard. Time ruled everything here. The work was repetitive but dangerous. The pace was relentless. Girls who couldn't keep up were replaced. On certain days, there were inspections. Not of safety equipment. There wasn't much to inspect, but of productivity. One of the cruelest aspects of the Bryant and May regime was how normal it all became. Despite all this, there were moments, brief, fragile moments, of something close to joy. But in the early hours of the morning, as the factory bell summoned them yet again, that courage was buried under layers of exhaustion and routine. And so they passed through the factory gates, one by one. The factory bell had called, and they had answered. Inside the match factory walls, time ticked differently. A strange silence fell. It wasn't total. There was the hum of voices, the occasional shout of a foreman, the creak of floorboards and benches, but it was subdued. Time off for illness, even illness caused by the job itself, meant no wages. And so they kept coming. Some tucked rags into their mouths to reduce the risk. Some tried not to breathe too deeply. Most simply hoped they would be one of the lucky ones. These girls, in the summer, the rooms would grow unbearably hot. Girls could be beaten or dismissed for dropping matches, for speaking out of turn, for failing to meet quotas. They were not allowed to leave the premises, so they ate what they had brought, usually bread, maybe cheese if they were lucky, and tea that had long since gone cold. Some sat on crates or benches. Others remained at their stations. The smell of phosphorus lingered even as they ate. Some girls stayed late, trying to make up their quotas. The light was even dimmer now, the shadows longer. They moved like ghosts through the phosphorus haze. Complaining was dangerous. Unionizing was unheard of. This was long before the famous Match Girls' strike, which would not take place until 1888. For now, the girls were voiceless. In winter, bitterly cold. But through it all, the phosphorus remained consistent, always there, always waiting. The girls worked at long wooden benches, sitting shoulder to shoulder, dipping and drying, stacking and packing. A few girls would disappear to the lavatories and never return, sick from the fumes or simply broken from the grind. Sometimes new girls would arrive halfway through the day, timid and hopeful. They were shown how to dip, where to stack, what not to say. Within days, they looked just like the others. Many as young as 13, they sang sometimes quietly, and only when the overseers weren't watching. Songs about love or loss or nonsense. But after 10 hours inside, it felt like heaven. The girls stumbled home, some laughing, some silent. Their clothes reeked of chemicals. Their hair was dusted white. Their lungs ached. It wasn't so much to entertain as it was to keep from going mad. They were usually shown the better sections, where the work was less toxic or the girls more presentable. Each match dipped was a gamble. Each day endured was a small triumph. And for many of these girls, that was all life had to offer. But the phosphorus rooms, with their sour air and sickly light, were kept hidden when possible. Still, word got out. One journalist described the factory as a place where death worked alongside life, and that wasn't far from the truth. A scrap of humanity in a place designed to strip it away. Knew the cost of speaking too freely. Aged 12 or 13, they were already veterans. By 15, some had lost friends or sisters to phossy jaw. By 20, many had teeth missing or chronic pain. And yet, there were few alternatives. Domestic service was an option, but it meant leaving home and subjecting oneself to long hours under a new master. The factory, at least, was familiar. Discipline ruled here. And more than discipline, there was fear. It was not measured by bells or clocks in the traditional sense, but by repetition, by the scraping of boots on dusty floors, by the shuffle of exhausted limbs, and by the near-silent rhythm of survival. The Bryant and May factory in Bow, East London, where most of the Matchstick girls worked, was a vast structure, looming like a stone giant behind thick iron gates. From the outside, it might resemble any other industrial building of the Victorian era, functional, sturdy, and gray. But inside, behind its solid walls, was a world laced with heat, danger, and the sharp sting of phosphorus. As the girls passed through the factory gates and filed into the workrooms, the work began almost immediately. There was no warm-up. This was the compound that made matches ignite when struck, but it was also a slow poison. At first, it caused headaches and nausea. Later, with enough exposure, it led to a horrifying condition known as phossy jaw. The jawbone would swell, abscess, and eventually rot, sometimes exposing bone and tissue. The pain was excruciating, and the smell, sickly sweet and metallic, could linger for hours. There was no effective treatment once it advanced. Teeth would fall out. Pieces of the jawbone might be surgically removed if the girl was lucky enough to get medical help, but most were not. No easing into the day. Each girl was assigned to one part of the production process, and the factory was divided into sections accordingly. First came the cutting of the wooden splints-long sheets of timber, sliced into thin match-length sticks. Then the dipping process began, and this is where the most notorious dangers lay. Girls would take handfuls of these splints and dip the ends into a paste that contained white phosphorus. Yet despite this, the girls kept dipping. They were paid by the piece, by the number of matchboxes they could fill or bundles they could prepare. The factory rooms were dusty and dark. The windows, coated in grime, allowed in very little natural light. And through it all, there was routine, the same motions, over and over, the same faces, hollowed with fatigue. One of the cruelties of the match factory was how early girls began to believe this was all they would ever do. There were occasional visitors to the factory, charity workers, reformers, and even the odd journalist. The overseers were mostly men, though a few older women served as floor supervisors. Some were kind, many were not. Lunch was a brief reprieve. After lunch, the dipping resumed. Hands stiffened. Eyes burned. The factory bell rang again at the end of the shift, but even then, not everyone could leave. Outside, the air was fresh, but not clean. East London in the 1880s was a swamp of coal smoke and human density. And tomorrow, they would return. Inside the match factory walls, the truth was simple. Survival was an act of will. There was a smell in the factory, sickly, metallic, a strange blend of garlic and rot. At first, you wouldn't know what it was. You might think it was the dust from the wood, or the sweat of too many bodies packed into too little space. But if you stayed long enough, if you worked close to the dipping trays day after day, you'd come to know it for what it was: phosphorus. The invention of the friction match in the early 1800s had revolutionized fire starting. No more striking steel on flint. No more smoldering embers carried from one home to another. A single stroke against a box and fire sprang to life. It felt like magic. It sold like magic. White phosphorus, the pale yellow poison that glowed faintly in the dark and burned its way into the bones of the girls who handled it. It didn't come on suddenly. It started with a toothache, a dull, throbbing pain that might have seemed like any other dental nuisance. But the ache didn't go away. It grew deeper, sharper. Then came swelling, usually along the lower jaw. The affected part of the jaw, often the lower mandible, would become necrotic. That means the bone tissue would literally die while still inside the body. Others became reclusive, shunned by neighbors, unable to find work or companionship. The disease left scars that were more than physical. It could spread into the bloodstream, causing multiple organ failure and ultimately death. Doctors were often helpless. They could try amputations or crude surgical drainage, but without antibiotics or modern anesthesia, the results were grim. It would decay from within, blacken, and sometimes emit a putrid smell. Pus oozed from abscesses in the cheeks or under the chin. Teeth fell out one by one. Eventually, the dead portions of jawbone might break off completely or require surgical removal. Even after such grisly procedures, the wound could take months or years to heal, if it ever healed at all. The skin would puff up and harden. The gums would darken and bleed. Many were orphans. Others came from families so large and so poor that sending daughters to work was the only way to put food on the table. Matchwork didn't require training. It didn't ask for literacy. All it demanded was time, obedience, and silence. But change came slowly. For the girls already poisoned, already scarred, it came too late. It ignites spontaneously in air, glows in the dark, and can cause severe chemical burns if touched. They marched, they picketed, and they demanded better conditions. And many more had lived on, hidden behind scarves and silence, reminders of a time when fire came at a terrible price. Their protest became one of the most iconic labor actions of Victorian England. But all of that was built on stories like this, on the bones of girls who dipped matches into poison because they were told it was their only option. And while it didn't eliminate the use of white phosphorus overnight, it shattered the illusion that these girls had no power. They weren't invisible. They weren't disposable. In countries like Sweden and Germany, laws were passed as early as the 1840s, banning the use of white phosphorus in match production. Yet in Britain, the practice continued well into the 20th century. When used in small amounts and handled properly, it could make matches light with the simplest flick. But when used carelessly in bulk, in crowded rooms, by workers who had no protection, it did far worse. It left them in history, and it asks us, even now, to remember the cost of convenience and the people who paid it. They had seen the evidence. They had heard the screams, but the profits were simply too good. Safer alternatives existed. Red phosphorus, for instance, was far less toxic and just as effective, but more expensive. And so, the dipping continued. The profits flowed, and the girls were told their sickness came from bad teeth, or poor hygiene, or just bad luck. At the heart of the matchstick industry in Victorian London was a chemical that made everything possible and everything dangerous. And the secret behind that miracle? White phosphorus. White phosphorus is a highly reactive form of the element. Inside the match factories, young girls dipped wooden splints into a slurry that contained white phosphorus. Their hands, their faces, their clothes were often dusted with it. Over time, without knowing it, they absorbed the toxin through their skin, breathed it in through invisible vapor, and sometimes even ingested it unknowingly while eating near their stations. The result was something truly horrifying: phossy jaw, also known medically as phosphorus necrosis of the jaw. Phossy jaw was one of the most feared industrial diseases of the 19th century, and then the bone would begin to rot. Victims described the pain as unbearable. There are documented cases of match girls with large portions of their face missing. Some wore cloths over their mouths to hide the disfigurement. In the worst cases, the phosphorus didn't stop at the jaw. And yet, they kept working. Why? Why would girls return to a job that might kill them, disfigure them, or slowly destroy their bodies from the inside out? Because they had no choice. In East London, especially in the poorer districts of Bow and Whitechapel, the match factories were one of the few places a young girl could earn money. The silence was the worst of all. For decades, factory owners and chemists knew the dangers of white phosphorus. In some factories, they were even fined if they missed a shift, no matter the reason. It wasn't just an occupational hazard. It was an institutional crime. When word began to spread, when newspapers started publishing testimonies and reformers demanded investigations, some improvements were made. One of the most disturbing facts about phossy jaw is that it was entirely preventable. In 1888, a turning point arrived. A group of match girls, brave, furious, and tired of silence, went on strike. The government eventually passed the White Phosphorus Prohibition Act in 1908, but by then, thousands had been exposed. Hundreds had died. Today, we talk about workplace safety as a given. We have protective gear, unions, regulations, and inspectors. The white phosphorus plague didn't just leave scars on faces. Inside the walls of the match factories, sickness did not invite sympathy. It did not summon compassion or understanding. Instead, it brought suspicion, cold dismissal, and sometimes outright cruelty. For the girls whose jaws ached with unbearable pain, whose faces swelled with festering abscesses, who felt their very bones dissolving into rot, there was no comfort from the factory owners. No sick leave, no doctor visits paid for, no kindness. only the harsh reality of being cast aside as useless, broken, or worse, liable for their own suffering. The early signs of phossy jaw, the terrible disease born of white phosphorus exposure, were subtle at first. A dull toothache, an uncomfortable swelling near the jawline, a faint discoloration of the gums. To any outsider, these might seem like common ailments, easily explained by poor dental hygiene or a hard life. But for the girls trapped in the dipping rooms, these symptoms were a silent death sentence. Often, the first person to notice the sickness was the girl herself, clutching her jaw between trembling fingers as waves of throbbing pain pulsed deep beneath the surface. Some tried to hide it. Others whispered quietly to friends, fearful of the consequences. Yet, to the factory bosses, these signs were not reasons for care. They were reasons for dismissal. One young girl, Mary, remembered how the pain began as a mere annoyance. At first, it felt like a small ache, she said years later, her voice trembling in a brittle whisper. But soon, my jaw swelled like a rotten fruit. The pain was like fire inside my face. When I told the foreman, he just laughed. "You're making it up," he said. "There's work to be done. No time for complaints." Mary was fired shortly after. She was not alone. Testimonies from former match factory workers reveal a pattern of ruthless neglect. Girls who developed abscesses or who complained of toothaches were accused of malingering or being lazy. Some were branded as troublemakers when they requested time off or medical help. The sick were often punished by fines or outright termination. There was no room in the factory for sympathy. In fact, sympathy was seen as a threat to productivity. The profits mattered more than human lives. Doctors who examined these girls often, after they were already disabled, found horrifying evidence of neglect. Jaws blackened and swollen, teeth falling out in clumps, pus-filled sores emitting a stench that could clear a room. Bone tissue, once white and strong, had turned to powder or was visibly crumbling beneath the skin. One doctor, who wished to remain anonymous for fear of retaliation, described the scene he encountered during a clandestine visit to a match factory. The air was thick with dust and a faint chemical sting. Girls sat with cloths pressed to their cheeks, eyes dull with exhaustion and pain. Their jaws were grotesquely swollen, and some had large holes where bone had been destroyed. It was like walking through a hospital ward for a disease no one dared to admit existed. But the factory owners dismissed these findings. When confronted with reports of illness, they often blamed the victims themselves. Bad teeth, they said, poor hygiene, weak constitutions. It was easier to believe the girls were at fault than to admit the truth that the factories were killing them. Real sympathy, real medical care never arrived. Instead, girls were told to keep working or leave. The fate of these sick girls was often brutal. Many were sent home with nothing but a dismissal notice and a mounting pile of pain. Without wages, without health care, many drifted into poverty or worse. Those who stayed were trapped by necessity. Families depended on their earnings. And in a world where child labor was common and social safety nets almost non-existent, losing a job could mean starvation. One haunting testimony comes from Ellen, who worked at Bryant and May's for 3 years before her jaw began to rot. "I begged the doctor for help, but he told me there was nothing to be done. The factory said I was a liability. They fired me without warning. I had no money, no food, and no hope. My family shunned me because of the smell. I hid in alleys, afraid to face the world. I thought death would be kinder." Ellen's story was tragically common. The disease was a slow killer, but the cruelty was immediate. What made the suffering even more unbearable was the cold indifference of those who could have helped. Government inspectors visited factories, but often turned a blind eye to the conditions. They accepted factory owners' assurances that all was well, or that illness was exaggerated. Even when reformers and journalists exposed the dangers, the system resisted change. The factory bosses wielded power not only over their workers, but over the political system itself. They used their influence to delay laws that would have saved lives. They denied the existence of phossy jaw as an occupational disease. They accused activists of spreading lies. The girls' suffering was dismissed as the price of progress. Inside the factory walls, sickness became an invisible punishment. Girls who developed phossy jaw were shunned, feared, and often ostracized by their peers. The disease was contagious only in the sense that it spread silently, invisibly, through the air and the hands of those who dipped matches daily. Families sometimes abandoned sick daughters, unable or unwilling to care for them. Some girls were forced into the workhouses or poorhouses where their pain was ignored. The social stigma attached to phossy jaw was immense. One letter from a former match girl, Annie, reveals the psychological toll. "My jaw is broken and black, and my face is a shame. I cover it with scarves when I go out, but the whispers follow me. People look away, as if I carry a plague. I feel like a ghost of who I once was. The factory took my health and left me nothing but pain and shame." Despite all this, some girls fought to survive. Some sought alternative jobs. Others found solace in each other's company. A few, when they could, became activists, telling their stories to anyone who would listen. Their courage eventually sparked a movement. The famous 1888 Match Girl strike was not just about wages or hours. It was about dignity, about the right to work without dying, about recognition of their humanity. But before that strike, before any government intervention, the girls endured years of sickness without sympathy. It is hard to imagine the loneliness and despair they must have felt. To be poisoned slowly, to watch your face rot away, and to be told that your pain was your own fault. No comfort from doctors, no support from bosses, no protection from laws. Only the silence of a society that chose profit over people. Medical records from hospitals at the time show an overwhelming number of young women admitted with phossy jaw, sometimes arriving in the final stages, their jaws broken and oozing pus. The treatments were crude and painful. Surgeons tried to remove the necrotic bone, but without antiseptics or effective anesthesia, the operations were brutal and often fatal. Many girls died from secondary infections or starvation because they could no longer eat. The images from these hospital wards are chilling. Doctors' notes describe girls with parts of their faces missing, with skin hanging in shreds, and with eyes sunken deep into swollen sockets. Yet the media largely ignored these human tragedies. Newspapers occasionally ran sympathetic articles, but factory owners threatened lawsuits or bribed editors to silence stories. Public awareness grew slowly, and real change was slow in coming. The White Phosphorus Prohibition Act would not pass until 1908, long after thousands of girls had been scarred or killed. Even then, some factories tried to evade the law, substituting one poison for another or hiding the extent of their workers' illness. The history of phossy jaw is a history of sickness without sympathy. It is a stark reminder of how industrial progress can trample human lives if unchecked. Today, when we walk past factories or use matches without a second thought, it is easy to forget the human cost. But for those girls, the cost was everything. The relentless clatter of wooden matchsticks, the dipping of countless splints into the poisonous phosphorus slurry. These were the sounds and motions that defined the working days of the match girls. But beneath the mechanical rhythm of production lay another harsh reality. The brutal economics that kept these girls trapped in poverty and pain. Yet even those meager earnings were often reduced further by deductions, fines, and punishments. The factory owners had built an entire system designed to squeeze the last drop of labor from these young bodies, paying as little as possible while demanding the impossible. This meant that workers were paid not by the hour, but by the number of matchboxes or sticks they produced. For every 1,000 matches dipped and packed, girls earned only a few pence. even the fastest workers struggled to make a living wage. Meanwhile, the pressure to meet quotas was relentless. Falling behind meant punishment. At first glance, this might seem like a chance for industrious girls to earn more by working faster, but the reality was far less generous. The wages they earned were pitifully small mere pennies, barely enough to stave off hunger. To understand the depths of this cruelty, we must look closely at the pay system itself. In the late 19th century, many factories operated under a piecework payment scheme. The rates for each completed box were set deliberately low, but that was not the worst of it. If a match broke or fell on the floor, that was a deduction too. Sometimes they fined us for things that weren't our fault. It felt like they wanted to keep our pay as low as possible, no matter how hard we worked. But for these young girls, the wages barely covered their own basic needs. The factories imposed fines for everything from broken matches to dirt on the floor, from tardiness to minor mistakes in packing. If a box had too many or too few matches, if a girl failed to meet her daily quota, if she arrived late or left early, she faced deductions from her already tiny pay. Sometimes the cost was deducted from wages. Even the tools they used, the sticks, the dipping trays, the brushes, were not free. There were always more impoverished children willing to step in. One former worker recalled, "We had to buy our own brushes, and if we lost one, it came out of our pay." The fines were brutal. A few broken matches might mean losing a penny or two a fortune to a girl who earned barely 6 or 7 pence a day. 1 penny might not sound like much today, but in Victorian London, it could mean the difference between a crust of bread or going hungry. Sometimes my hands would tremble from exhaustion and my jaw would throb with pain. But if I stopped, I wouldn't get paid. And if I got sick, I would be thrown out. Many girls worked 14 or 15 hours a day, sometimes more, yet returned home with less than the cost of a man's daily meal. Men working in factories or as laborers often earned several shillings a day, enough to feed themselves and sometimes their families. Every day was a battle, not just with the work, but with the bosses who wanted to take our pay. Girls raced to finish their boxes first, desperate for every penny. They received envelopes with their wages, sometimes barely enough to buy food for the next day. The inequality was staggering. Those broken or rejected matches would be deducted from her daily output. This wage system was not only unfair, it was designed to keep the girls dependent and silent. The factory owners knew that if the girls spoke up or complained, they could be replaced easily. Because many of the girls came from destitute families or were orphans, they had no bargaining power. They couldn't afford to lose their jobs, no matter how sick or exhausted they felt. They could not refuse the work, even if it poisoned their bodies and destroyed their health. Another young worker, Margaret, described a typical day. "If I stopped working, my brothers and sisters would go hungry. I swallowed the pain and kept going, hoping that someday things would get better. We started before dawn, working through the cold morning and the heat of the afternoon. The work was hard and never-ending. This constant fear kept many girls pushing beyond their limits." The piecework system also created tension and competition among workers. Yet even the most diligent worker found herself at the mercy of the factory's harsh rules. If a girl made a single mistake, say, dipping a splint unevenly so the matches didn't strike well, she might be penalized. The supervisors watched closely, quick to reprimand or fine. "You'd think they wanted to break our spirits," one girl recalled. And the deductions weren't always clear or fair. Many girls never saw detailed pay slips. Families lived hand to mouth, scraping together every penny. In some cases, girls were paid so little that they had to steal matches or scraps from the factory just to survive. Fines and deductions swallow their pay, leaving them little more than slaves in all but name. The economic system wasn't just about wages, it was about control. The low pay and harsh punishments ensured the girls stayed obedient. Even when the threat of phossy jaw loomed, The fear of losing those meager pennies was stronger. One heartbreaking letter from a former worker named Clara reveals this painful choice. "I knew the matches were killing me, but what choice did I have?" For many, that hope never came. The wage system also reinforced the wider social inequalities of the era. Girls were paid less than boys, who earned more for heavier, less delicate labor. Women's work was undervalued. Their bodies were exploited for profit, while their suffering was ignored. The factory owners' greed was reflected in the daily lives of the girls. Long hours left no time for education or rest. Poor nutrition and exhaustion weakened their bodies further, and the constant pressure to produce made the already dangerous working environment even more hazardous. Sweat and tears, and often with broken bodies. In one shocking example, a girl was fined for making too much noise. When her jaw ached so badly, she cried out in pain. The cost of survival was paid in blood. Several contemporary reports attempted to highlight these injustices. In 1888, the investigative journalist Annie Besant published an expose revealing the cruel wage system and brutal fines. She wrote, "The girls toil from morning till night for wages so low they can scarcely afford bread." Her words helped fuel the Match Girls' strike, a historic labor action that shook London, making it difficult for girls to earn a stable income. But before that moment of courage and rebellion, the girls endured years of exploitation and grinding poverty. And even after the strike, many factories resisted fair wages and decent working conditions. Some employers replaced piecework with fixed daily wages, but those were still barely livable. Others continued the practice of fines and deductions, but for the right to earn a living wage, a right we often take for granted. Beyond the factory walls, the girls' poverty affected their entire lives. Many could not afford medical treatment for the diseases they contracted. They struggled to feed themselves and their families. Their health deteriorated not only from toxic chemicals, but from hunger and exhaustion. The wages, so small and precarious, locked them in a cycle of poverty. Of the most tragic aspects of this wage system was that it punished girls for injuries and illnesses caused by their work, a cycle reinforced by sickness and hardship. 1. If a girl's jaw swelled or her hands were too sore to work, she was fined or dismissed. No compensation was given. No medical care. Only the cold calculation of lost labor and lost profit. This harsh reality became a defining feature of life for the Match Girls. It is impossible to understand their suffering without recognizing how deeply intertwined their health, their work, and their wages were. Their bodies bore the scars of chemical exposure. Their pockets were emptied by fines. Their lives were shaped by the merciless demands of the factory. And all for a few pennies a day. Today, as we think about fair wages and workers' rights, it is worth remembering the girls who worked long hours in poisonous factories for wages so low they could barely live. Their struggles paved the way for labor reforms, fair pay, and workplace protections. But their stories remind us how far those reforms had to travel. From the clinking of matchsticks to the clinking of pennies in their pockets, the Match Girls' fight was not just for safer work. From the moment the factory gates swung open at dawn, an invisible presence loomed over every girl who stepped inside. It was a presence felt in the quickened heartbeat, the swallowed sighs, the nervous glances cast at every corner. The overseers, mostly men, older and grimmer than the girls they watched, were the true rulers of the match factories, and who crushed any flicker of rebellion before it could grow. Their eyes pierced through the fog of white phosphorus dust and sweat. Their voices cracked like whips through the noisy halls. They were the keepers of order, but also the enforcers of silence, speed, and obedience. Within these factories, the overseers held absolute power. They were the ones who dictated how fast the work must be done, who punished those who faltered. Their faces were often set in harsh lines, lips thin and tight, as if the faintest smile was a betrayal of their authority. They carried wooden sticks or rods, symbols of their power, and the threat of physical punishment was never far behind. The girls learned early on that the overseers were not to be questioned. The very atmosphere inside the factory was charged with tension and fear, not just of the deadly chemical that silently ate away at their bodies, but of the men who watched them constantly, ready to punish any perceived slip. Discipline was brutal and unyielding. If we spoke out of turn, if we slowed for even a moment, the rod would come down, not always hitting, but always enough to make you jump. If you tried, the overseer would shout, "Quiet. Work, no chatting." Sometimes, if he caught you, he'd make you stand with your head against the wall for minutes. It was humiliating. The overseers prowled the factory floors like hawks. One former match girl, who went by the name of Lucy in later testimonies, recalled, "The overseers were always near, eyes darting, ready to snap at us like dogs." Faster meant more matches dipped, more boxes filled, and ultimately more profit. It wasn't just the threat of physical pain that kept the girls in line. The overseers demanded silence. Talking was forbidden. Laughter was punished. In the claustrophobic, dust-filled rooms where hundreds of girls dipped matchsticks one by one, the only acceptable sound was the steady, mechanical clinking of sticks against trays. Any whisper, any murmur, was met with immediate reprimand. "We weren't allowed to talk," one girl said years later. This enforced silence served a purpose beyond mere discipline. It isolated the girls from each other, preventing camaraderie or collective resistance. But even in that silence, fear spoke volumes. The overseers reported their failures to management, who then deducted fines from their already meager wages. The overseers also controlled the pace of work. Speed was everything. But speed came at a cost. The girls were often pushed beyond their limits, their hands trembling, eyes watering from the chemical dust, jaws aching from exposure. If a girl slowed down, if her hands faltered or her attention wavered, the overseers noticed instantly. One girl recalled the cruel words she heard from a supervisor after a brief pause to wipe the sweat from her brow. "Stop dawdling, lazy bones. You want to be out on the street? Then get moving." The men wielded authority, granted by management and protected by law. The girls had little recourse. Those who failed to keep pace risked not only verbal abuse, but financial penalties. Every breath felt measured. It was as if the walls themselves were listening. The threat of losing pay was a powerful tool of control. Beyond the rods and harsh words, overseers sometimes used more subtle methods to maintain dominance. They spread rumors, pit workers against each other, and rewarded those who behaved with small privileges, like slightly better stations or lighter workloads. In a cruel way, the overseers operated like a shadow government inside the factory, shaping the daily lives of the girls with fear and manipulation. Several testimonies from former match workers reveal the psychological toll this constant surveillance exacted. One woman named Sarah wrote in her memoirs, "We were watched every moment. I never dared look at the overseer directly for fear of anger. The overseer's power extended beyond the factory floor. They controlled breaks and dictated bathroom visits, often denying them or punishing girls who took too long. Some girls hid the pain or nausea caused by phosphorus poisoning, fearing that any sign of weakness would draw the overseer's wrath. The relationship between overseers and workers was one of stark imbalance. Complaints were dismissed or punished. Attempts to organize or speak out risked harsh retaliation. This oppressive atmosphere contributed to the girls' isolation and suffering. One especially cruel overseer was known for shouting threats like, "If you don't like the work, leave. There are plenty more who will take your place." The factory was a world where obedience was not just demanded, but enforced by fear of pain, poverty, and expulsion. Physical punishments were not uncommon. Girls were struck with sticks, slapped, or pushed. Some described being made to stand in painful positions as public humiliation, though violence was sometimes hidden from official reports. Whispered accounts and testimonies speak of the overseer's brutality. The girls lived in a constant state of dread, afraid to show weakness, afraid to fall behind, afraid to draw attention. In the eyes of the overseers, they were disposable labor. When the 1888 Match Girls' strike erupted, part of the rebellion was against these overseers, against their cruelty and oppression. The strike broke a long-held silence, exposing the daily torment and injustice. Yet before that moment of collective courage, the overseer's shadow darkened every corner of the factories. They were the gatekeepers of a world where sickness, poverty, and pain were met not with care, but with punishment. In understanding the lives of the Match Girls, one cannot overlook the oppressive presence of these men who enforced silence with rods and eyes like hawks. The overseers embodied the industrial cruelty of an age when profit was king and human suffering was the price paid in silence. Inside the cold, grim factories where the Match Girls toiled, happiness was a fragile, fleeting thing. The days were long, the air thick with toxic white phosphorus dust and the smell of sweat and chemicals. The relentless clatter of wooden sticks being dipped, dried, and boxed filled every corner. Overseers patrolled the rooms like hawks, ready to snap at any whisper or chuckle. She spoke of how the girls would gather quietly in a corner of the dipping room, their heads bent low, voices barely above a whisper. Those brief intervals of song were sometimes the only relief they had from the endless, grinding labor. A smile was a tiny act of defiance, a way to preserve dignity when everything else was taken away. It required an extraordinary kind of emotional resilience to keep that spark alive in such a hostile environment. They grieved their own changing bodies, the jaws that swelled and rotted, the hands that shook, the backs that bent. They returned to crowded, poverty-stricken homes where hunger, illness, and social stigma awaited. The scars from their illness were not just physical. Neighbors sometimes shunned those disfigured by phossy jaw, and families struggled to care for daughters who could no longer work. The overseers demanded silence not just to maintain order, but to prevent unity. By forbidding conversation, laughter, and song, they tried to isolate the girls from each other and crush any collective spirit. To smile or laugh could mean punishment from the overseer's scolding, fines, or physical reprimands. Many girls described how, despite everything, they found moments of laughter, sometimes a shared joke about the overseers, sometimes a silly story whispered to a friend. These moments offered brief escapes from the relentless demands of the factory and the poisoning of their bodies. The girls learned to be cautious, to keep their moments of joy brief and hidden. But the very act of hiding those smiles, of pretending to be resigned and broken, exacted its own toll. They were survivors who, despite sickness, poverty, and oppression, found ways to smile, to sing, and to resist. Their courage and resilience continue to inspire us today. They endured not only physical suffering, but emotional hardship that would have broken many. Their ability to find light amid darkness is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. It added layers of loneliness and stress to already overwhelming suffering. They also serve as a call to remember the cost of those moments, the pain endured, the risks taken, and the strength required to hold on to humanity when the world tried to strip it away. Yet despite these efforts, the girls found ways to connect through shared smiles, secret glances, and whispered songs. In such harsh circumstances, the resilience required to smile became a survival skill. It was a quiet refusal to be completely defeated by their situation. When the overseer caught wind of it, he stormed over, furious. But instead of punishing them harshly, he grudgingly allowed them a few more moments of song, perhaps recognizing the desperate need for relief. Such small acts of kindness, rare as they were, meant everything to the girls. The contrast between the harsh reality and the fleeting moments of joy was heartbreaking. But for the girls themselves, it was simply the way to live. Every smile was a small victory against the despair that threatened to consume them. Smiling in the factory meant hiding pain and fear behind a brave front, presenting strength even when inside they felt broken. The girls bore not only physical wounds, but the crushing psychological weight of their situation. The emotional bonds forged in the shadows of the factory were a powerful force, sustaining them through the darkest hours. They lived with constant pain, the knowledge that their work was slowly poisoning them, and the fear of losing what little income they had. The songs brought comfort, reminded them of home, and reminded them that they were still human beings, not just cogs in a merciless machine. Talking was forbidden, and singing even more so. The girls understood that any breach of silence could lead to harsh rebuke, fines, or worse. No singing, no talking. Work, not play. The girls learned to swallow their joy, hiding smiles behind downcast eyes or stiff faces. The factory demanded submission. Any display of happiness was considered insolence or laziness. A smile could be taken as a challenge, a refusal to obey. The girls quickly understood that to survive, they had to mask their true feelings beneath layers of exhaustion and fear. Yet, in secret, they sang. When the overseers' backs were turned, soft voices would rise in timid melody, songs passed down from their families or picked up in the streets. She described how, in the moments when the pain felt unbearable, she would close her eyes and think of happier times, her mother's smile, a favorite song, the warmth of her childhood home. Those memories helped her summon a faint smile, just enough to keep going through the endless shifts. But the effort was exhausting, both physically and mentally. The cost of that smile was the constant battle against despair. Sometimes these were lullabies, gentle and soothing. Other times, they were ballads of hardship and hope. Singing was a small rebellion, a way to claim a little joy amid the grim routine. The girls' bodies were pushed to the limits, their jaws aching from the poison slowly eating their bones, their hands trembling from exhaustion, their backs stiff from hours bent over work tables. In such brutal conditions, smiles and laughter seemed almost impossible, yet, surprisingly, they existed. Small moments of joy flickered through the misery, like fragile flames in the dark. Some girls found ways to hold on to their humanity, even when everything around them threatened to crush it. They sang quietly, sharing whispered songs from their childhoods or the streets of London, a soft thread that connected them in a world designed to isolate. A few managed fleeting smiles, stolen glances that spoke of hope or rebellion, even if only for a second. These acts of joy were a balm against the crushing weight of pain, fear, and exhaustion. But the cost of such moments was high. In factories where overseers demanded silence and obedience, where any sign of happiness was viewed with suspicion and punished, the price of a smile could be severe. The match girls quickly learned that the factory was no place for laughter. Mary, who worked at Bryant and May's, remembered those rare moments vividly. But such moments were painfully brief. The overseer's sharp voices soon cut through the air, commanding silence. Yet the desire to smile and laugh did not disappear. In fact, it became even more vital. Anne, another former match worker, spoke about the struggle to hold on to hope. Behind every smile was a story of silent suffering. The girls mourned friends who fell ill or disappeared from the factory, victims of phosphorus poisoning or the brutal working conditions. Outside the factory walls, the girls' lives were no easier. Psychologists today might recognize this resilience as emotional survival, an ability to maintain hope, dignity, and a sense of self in the face of overwhelming adversity. The factory's oppressive atmosphere made these acts of joy all the more remarkable. These small moments of connection provided comfort and strength. They reminded the girls that they were not alone, that others shared their pain and their hope. The price of maintaining that spark was enormous. Yet even the harshest conditions could not extinguish the human spirit. One story tells of a group of girls who, despite the overseer's warnings, sang a popular tune softly during a lunch break. In the wider context, these moments of joy highlight the incredible resilience of the match girls. Their smiles and songs stand as powerful reminders that even in the bleakest conditions, people see connection, hope, and joy. As we reflect on their stories, we are reminded that the match girls were not just victims of industrial cruelty. In the gloomy, phosphorus-tainted air of the match factories, beneath the harsh clatter of wooden sticks and the overseer's sharp commands, a quiet and dangerous thing began to stir. The girls knew they were paid a pittance for dangerous work. They understood the cruelty of fines that robbed them of what little they earned. And if we complain, they say there are plenty more who'll take our place. How can that be right? Slowly, the girls began to understand that their suffering was not an accident, but a result of deliberate exploitation. That the dangers and injustices they faced were not their burden to bear alone. Began the overseers and factory managers were ruthless in maintaining control. They kept tight watch for any signs of dissent. Girls caught talking too much or questioning their conditions faced immediate reprimands, fines, or dismissal. The risk was real and terrifying. The girls knew that these documents might never reach factory owners or government officials, but the act of writing them was itself an act of defiance, too. They spoke of the women who wore scarves to hide the decay in their jaws, of those who disappeared altogether, swallowed by poverty and disease. It was just small things, a whispered complaint here. Social reformers, journalists, and labor activists became allies, amplifying the girls' voices in public forums. These early protests helped pave the way for larger, more organized actions that would follow. From whispered complaints to whispered plans, the first sparks of rebellion ignited in those dark factory rooms. A shared sigh there. Their lives were fragile, their bodies already weakened by the poisons they handled daily. The risks of protest were immense. Reports of the girls' plight, fueled by testimonies from courageous workers, reached sympathetic ears. They wanted to speak out, to demand better pay and safer conditions, but they had little protection. The threat of losing their jobs, and thus their only means to survive, hung over them like a dark cloud. The injustices inside the match factories became part of a growing public conversation about workers' rights, child labor, and industrial safety. But soon we dared to say more. We talked about the sickness, the fines, the overseer's cruelty. Saying those things was like lighting a fire in the dark. Share their stories with one another. The deductions for broken matches that were no fault of their own. The punishments for minor mistakes. The endless demands to work faster despite aching bodies. It was barely audible at first, a murmur, Jane whispered to a close friend during a rare break. A soft whisper exchanged in shadowed corners or behind trembling hands. But it grew steadily, fueled by exhaustion. Pain, Lucy later recalled how difficult it was to even speak those words aloud, and the unbearable weight of injustice. Some of the match girls began to question. They started to talk not just in stolen moments of song or laughter, but in hushed voices about their conditions, their pay, and the cruelty that defined their days. The first whispers of protest had begun. This was no small thing. Eyes wide but determined. These shared frustrations forged a fragile solidarity. In a world where silence was demanded and obedience enforced by threat and punishment, to question authority was a bold, risky act. For these young girls, many orphans, many desperate for work, speaking out could mean immediate dismissal, blacklisting, or worse yet. The seeds of discontent had been planted, and they took root. It began with conversations about unfair wages. One girl, "We work all day and barely earn enough for bread." Her friend nodded. The girls had endured pain and fear for so long that even to imagine standing up felt revolutionary. Another young worker, at first, these whispered conversations spread quietly through the factory floors, sowing the first threads of a collective awareness. But the path from whispering to action was perilous. Despite this, the girls pressed on, sharing stories of the sick and the injured, of those who had been thrown out for missing a shift or falling ill. It was a slow awakening, one built on courage and desperation. Outside the factory gates, some reformers and social activists began to take notice. But inside, the girls had to navigate a delicate balance. One of the earliest documented moments of this growing unrest was the circulation of petitions and letters, often written in secret and passed quietly from hand to hand. They expressed their desire for fair wages, the abolition of fines, reasonable working hours, and an end to the use of deadly white phosphorus. As these first calls for justice gained momentum, the girls began to form informal groups, small circles of trust, where they could share fears, hopes, and plans. In these pockets of quiet rebellion, they found strength in numbers. The match girls' whispered discontent soon rippled beyond the factory walls. But the girls themselves remained vulnerable. Still, the courage to speak out grew. It was the beginning of a fight, not just for better conditions, but for dignity and respect. A fight that would challenge the very heart of industrial exploitation. And though the road ahead was long and uncertain, those first whispers marked the start of a powerful movement that would change the course of history for the match girls and for workers everywhere. The factory walls stood tall and silent, hiding their horrors behind soot-darkened brick, and the hum of industry got inside. The match girls labored in toxic air. Their suffering remained invisible to the world beyond Bow. But every system of silence eventually cracks, and sometimes all it takes is one voice. Their pain muffled, their complaints ignored, a mother in it. She detailed the conditions inside Bryant and May's match factory with unflinching clarity in order. The long hours, the poverty wages, the phossy jaw disfigurements, the unjust fines, and the brutal overseers advocate for. Others told of being fined for sitting down, for coughing, for needing a moment of rest. Furious at the attention, denied the accusations. Poor, shocked by her vivid account. But from the street through murmurs, rumors, and stories passed among women in the East End, began to ask questions. And a passionate believer in the power of working people to demand better lives. A writer, a campaigner, Annie, was sharp, fearless, and entirely unwilling to accept injustice in silence. Their lives treated as disposable. The time. She heard of the match girls. She helped them speak for themselves. She knew what they risked. It was solidarity, already well known in. And she had ignited something no one could put out. Radical circles as a force of nature. For years, born in London in 1847, Annie Besant had lived many lives before her path crossed with theirs. A clergyman's wife turned secularist, by and on. And in the summer of 1888, that voice belonged to Annie Besant. They insisted their workers were treated fairly. They pressured the girls to sign statements refuting the article. The headline alone was explosive, told the stories no one wanted to hear, and drew a direct line between the wealth of factory owners and the suffering of their workers. She described the toxic fumes, a proud symbol of British industrial success, found itself under sudden scrutiny. And in the course of her activism, she had come into contact with girls who worked at the Bryant and May match factory. The public, Bryant and May, the company, executives called Annie a liar. She gave names to the faceless. She was unlike anyone the match girls had ever met. The first whispers of factory cruelty reached her not through formal reports or press releases. Annie had long worked with London's working-class communities. What she heard from them was chilling. Some girls described the smell of decaying jawbone. One girl said simply, "They care more for their matches than for our lives." They spoke of deductions so steep that some girls earned only 4 pence a day after fines. She knew what kind of power they were up against. She spoke of her admiration for the girls' bravery, their humor, their resilience. She wrote of how their courage inspired her, how their dignity amid suffering reminded her why the struggle mattered. She never once claimed to have saved them. The public, stirred by Annie's writing and the bravery of the girls, began to demand answers from Bryant and May. Questions were raised in Parliament, pamphlets circulated. The plight of the Match Girls became a rallying cry for labor activists and social reformers across Britain. Instead, she said, they saved themselves. I merely lit the fuse. And yet, she also saw something else. A growing fire, a refusal to be silent any longer. But by teenage girls armed with courage, hope, and the determination to be heard. She never treated them as helpless victims. She treated them as equals, as allies in a greater fight for justice. That belief, more than anything, gave the Match Girls the strength to act. They spoke of their jaws swelling, of the stench of infection, of friends who had vanished after falling ill. They spoke of overseers who barked orders and punished even the faintest trace of joy. For young, impoverished girls, many still in their teens, it was unheard of. There were no unions backing them, no safety nets if things went wrong. She provided meeting spaces, helped coordinate communication, and began planning for a potential strike. Meanwhile, public pressure continued to grow. The Pall Mall Gazette, the Times, and other major papers began to cover the story. Journalists started interviewing workers. Medical experts stepped forward to confirm the horrors of phosphorus poisoning. And the women behind the movement, many of them as young as 14, began to find their voices. They knew that walking out could mean permanent unemployment. But something had shifted. Annie's article had given their suffering a voice. The girls now knew they weren't invisible. They weren't alone. They spoke of long hours, cruel rules, and the slow, inevitable poisoning that crept into their bones with each shift. Annie listened, and she believed them. At a time when the poor were often blamed for their own misery, when female workers were considered too ignorant to understand their rights, Annie saw something else entirely. She saw intelligence, strength, and a quiet desperation ready to rise into defiance if only someone would help light the way. In June of 1888, Annie published an article in her weekly newspaper, The Link, titled "White Slavery in London." The reaction was immediate and incendiary. Middle-class readers were horrified. Social reformers rallied behind her. But the girls refused. It was a turning point. In the days that followed, Annie returned to the East End, visiting the Match Girls again. This time, she asked a different question. Would they be willing to strike? It was an audacious idea. Strikes were risky even for skilled male workers. And perhaps for the first time, they realized that their pain wasn't just personal, it was political. Over the next few weeks, Annie helped the girls organize, offering not just inspiration, but practical support. Annie didn't speak for them. She encouraged them to write their own statements, to explain what life inside the factory was really like. In private meetings, Annie was moved by their courage. This was not charity. Annie's involvement with the Match Girls was not just a campaign. It was a relationship built on mutual respect. In her diaries and letters, Annie later wrote about the early days of the movement, and that fuse was burning fast. By the time July arrived, the whispers that had begun in the shadows of the factory had turned into something louder, something the world could no longer ignore. Annie stood beside them throughout, not in front, not above, beside them. She had become the match-sharp, bright, dangerous to those in power. But the battle was just beginning. What followed would be one of the most iconic labor struggles in British history. An uprising not led by politicians or union bosses. And standing with them, as the spark that lit the fire, was Annie Besant. There had been whispers for weeks. Quiet conversations behind cupped hands, exchanged glances across the dipping rooms, nods of agreement that never dared become words. But by July 1888, the silence inside Bryant and May's factory had turned into something louder. It began with fear, But it didn't stay there. The match girls had reached their breaking point, but had never dared say aloud they were being exploited, poisoned, and discarded. After Besant's article was published and drew national attention, Bryant and May tried to save face. Management demanded that the workers sign statements denying everything, and the factory, for all its profits, treated them as less than human. For years, they had endured the sickness, the fines, the endless hours, and the constant supervision. They had kept their heads down and their mouths shut. But now, something had changed. Annie Besant's explosive article, White Slavery in London, had given voice to what the girls had long known. Then came the final spark. They wanted the girls to say they were treated well, paid fairly, and protected. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. She had written. One girl refused. Her defiance cost her dearly. She was fired. But her bravery didn't go unnoticed. That was the moment it broke. Headlines blared the story across Britain. Match girls on strike. East End girls demand justice. But by the next day, more girls joined. Within days, over 1,400 workers, nearly the entire workforce, had walked out of Bryant and May's gates. And the public, already stirred by Besant's expose, listened. A small group of her co-workers, furious and emboldened, downed tools in protest. The overseers, taken aback. People began to send money, food, and letters of support. Their faces were pale, their clothes poor, but their eyes burned with determination. Some who had never spoken a word in public now stood tall before crowds. She met with labor leaders, coordinated donations, and ensured that the girls had somewhere to gather, to plan, to breathe. The girls stood outside every day, holding the line not with signs and chants, but with quiet endurance. Their reputation was crumbling. Orders were delayed. Public support was evaporating. The match girls were winning, not just the attention of the press, but the moral high ground. Annie Besant stood beside them, but she didn't speak for them. The girls spoke for themselves. They were cold. They were hungry. Many were afraid, but none of them went back inside. They asked for the right to organize, to be treated as workers, not disposable girls. They walked not just for better pay, but for respect, for dignity, for the right to live without their jaws rotting from the inside out. Another spoke about working 16 hours and coming home with just a few pennies, barely enough for a loaf of bread. Issued threats. It was proof that even the most powerless poor, uneducated girls from the slums of East London could stand up to one of the largest companies in the country and win. It was bold, it was dangerous, and it was completely unprecedented. They hadn't fixed every problem, and the dangers of phosphorus poisoning would continue for years until legislation finally banned it. Politicians debated workers' rights in Parliament. Labor movements across Britain looked to the match girls' strike as a blueprint for action. Women everywhere saw a new kind of role model, not queens or reformers, but working-class girls who dared to say no. But they had lit a flame, and the world was watching. It was about the refusal to accept suffering as fate, about standing together in the face of power, about choosing dignity over fear. The streets of Bow filled with the clamor of voices no longer willing to be silenced. Young women and girls, many of them no older than. Some were forever changed by the experience, having seen what solidarity could achieve. They had walked out as factory girls and returned as history makers. But what they did have was each other, and a growing fire inside them that could no longer be ignored. 16 marched side by side. They had no formal training in organizing, no legal representation, and no official union support. She always credited the girls their courage, their clarity, their refusal to be broken. She had helped give them a platform. But it was their voices that carried the weight. London noticed. The sight of over 1,000 working-class girls marching through the streets caused a stir. People stopped to stare. Reporters scribbled in their notepads. The girls gave interviews. They told the public about the fines for talking, the deductions for broken matches, the punishments for sitting down. They spoke about the rotting jaws, the stench of infection, the girls who had died and never been named. Not everyone approved. Some called them unruly. Some accused Annie Besant of stirring up trouble. Bryant and May issued statements denying everything, painting the girls as ungrateful, their stories as exaggerated. But more and more, the tide of sympathy turned toward the strikers. Annie Besant, now firmly entwined in the movement, helped organize public meetings. The match girls began to hold rallies. They spoke in halls and on street corners. One girl, barely 15, spoke through trembling lips about how her sister had died, coughing up pieces of bone. These weren't just protests. They were revelations. For 3 weeks, the factory stood nearly empty. Bryant and May tried to hire replacements, but few dared cross the line. Behind closed doors, Bryant and May's leadership was in chaos. Eventually, the factory's directors had no choice. They agreed to meet with the girls' representatives, most of them barely old enough to vote. They demanded an end to unfair fines. They demanded safer conditions. And astonishingly, they won. Bryant and May agreed to abolish the fines. They pledged to improve working conditions. They even permitted the formation of a union, the Union of Women Matchmakers, one of the first women-led trade unions in British history. The strike had lasted just under a month, but its impact would echo for decades. It was more than just a win for better wages. It was a challenge to every notion of who deserved justice, who could fight back, and who had a voice worth hearing. The match girls returned to work with their heads high. In the days that followed, newspapers praised their bravery. Many of the girls would go on to remain active in the labor movement. Others returned to quiet lives. For Annie Besant, the strike was a defining moment, but she never claimed it as her own victory. And long after the headlines faded, those voices would continue to echo. The Match Girls' strike of 1888 wasn't just about matches. It wasn't even just about Girls Dot. It was a reminder that even the smallest spark, when shared, can set fire to injustice. The strike may have started with anger, but what kept it alive, what turned it from a walkout into a revolution, was unity. These weren't seasoned labor leaders or trained negotiators. Most of the match girls couldn't read or write fluently. Many had never been farther than the streets around the factory. They were daughters of dock workers and washerwomen, orphans and eldest sisters, some just 13 or 14 years old. But in those tense, unpredictable weeks of July 1888, they showed a kind of strength that left even their critics stunned. They were organizing themselves. At first, it was chaotic. The girls had no formal structure. They met in cramped rooms above pubs and community halls, sometimes gathering in schoolyards or alleys where they wouldn't draw too much attention. They spoke about what they endured inside Bryant and May, being fined for dropping a match, being mocked when they fainted, being told to keep quiet when their jaws swelled and their teeth loosened from rot. We want what's fair. We want the fines gone. We want clean work, not poison. Her words struck a chord. Working men's unions, radical groups, and even a few concerned clergymen offered their support. Bread and soup were delivered to strike meetings. A local printer offered to help produce handbills. A group of East End women brought blankets when the girls spent a cold night outside the factory gates. These weren't helpless girls begging for mercy. They were workers demanding dignity. If we don't speak, who will? These girls weren't chosen because of education or background. Just 19 years old, she worked as a box maker and had witnessed years of abuse inside the factory. She was known for her sharp mind and calm presence, and soon she became a leading figure in the strike. When the factory owners finally agreed to meet with representatives, Sarah was among those who walked into the boardroom, not to beg, but to speak plainly. They were chosen for their grit, for how they had stood up to overseers. There were hugs and tears and laughter in the same streets that had been filled with silence and fear just weeks earlier. The girls hadn't just returned to work with better pay. They had returned with their heads held high. They understood that the strike had been a turning point, not an end. They held meetings to explain the changes to younger girls and shouted at a group of men trying to harass the strikers. "We ain't here for your fun. We are here for our rights. We're cold either way, but we don't leave each other." They continued speaking to the press, telling their stories in their own words. Annie Besant continued to support and guide them, but she made it clear this was their victory. Rumors flew about what was happening behind closed doors. Then the doors opened, and for the first time in the history of Bryant and May, the bosses had yielded. For how they had kept spirits high when others felt like giving up. They were trusted because they had suffered alongside everyone else. But word spread fast. Even without leaflets or telephones, the girls found each other. They shared information, relayed updates from Annie Besant and other supporters, and began forming something remarkable, a collective voice, with no power, no money, no protection. Just courage, unity, and the belief that they were worth more than what they'd been told. "Better to be hungry than in the dark," she said. Their meetings were raw but electric. Some girls stood up to speak for the first time in their lives, quiet at first, then stronger as others nodded and clapped. She and the other delegates laid out their demands. No more unjust fines, no more wage deductions, improved working conditions, and respect for the girls' right to organize. "I'm not afraid of them anymore," one girl reportedly said at an early meeting. The press began to take more notice, not just of Annie Besant, but of the girls themselves. The Match Girls had shown that working-class women could lead, organize, and win. They had refused to be silent. They had refused to be broken. And their actions laid the groundwork for labor movements, suffrage campaigns, and social reforms that would follow in the decades ahead. And most importantly, the girls had secured the right to form a union, the Union of Women Matchmakers. For the first time, reporters listened to the workers rather than the factory owners. Some of the girls even gave statements to journalists, standing in borrowed boots and ill-fitting jackets, speaking with East End accents that the upper classes usually mocked. But now, people were listening. One article in a London paper quoted a worker named Eliza, who said, "We don't want charity." Outside the factory, the girls found unexpected allies. Inside those meetings, a strategy was forming. They elected delegates, young women, who would represent the group in negotiations with Bryant and May. Sarah Chapman was one of those delegates, and she did. There were no dramatics, no trembling apologies. The men across the table, many in tailored suits and clean gloves, had likely never imagined such composure from the very workers they had long dismissed as replaceable. Back outside, the girls waited, biting their nails, arms linked. The fines were to be abolished. There would be changes to factory oversight. It was more than anyone had dared hope. That night, the celebrations were loud, not wild, but joyful. And they had done it together. Even in the days following their victory, the Match Girls kept organizing. The stories from those final weeks were filled with small, powerful moments, acts of bravery and solidarity that had rarely been seen among working women in Britain. There was Maggie, no more than 15, who had stood on a crate outside the gates. There was Nora, who gave up her dinner money to buy candles for the next meeting. And there was the girl whose name history never recorded, one among hundreds who wrapped a sick friend in her shawl during a rainstorm, saying, "These weren't heroes in the way history books usually define them, but they were brave. They were organized, and they were unforgettable." Their strike sent ripples across Britain. For the first time, the public had seen a women-led movement not based in the drawing rooms of reformers, but on the factory floor. When asked later how they'd managed it, some of the girls gave simple answers. We talked. We stood by each other. We'd had enough. In the end, what made the Match Girls' story so remarkable wasn't it that they succeeded, it was how they did it. And once they had stood up, they never stood alone again. The streets of Bow were quieter now. The shouting had faded. The crowds had dispersed. But inside the hearts of over 1,000 Match Girls, something permanent had shifted. They returned to their factory, not as the same girls who had once walked those long wooden floors, hunched and silent, breathing in poison and fear. They returned taller, not always in stature, but in presence, in pride, in knowing they had changed something. Maybe everything. It was quieter, steadier built not on grand speeches, but on tired feet and blistered hands. But it was real. After 3 weeks of defiance, the Bryant and May directors finally gave in. They had watched their profits stall, seen the public turn against them, and faced the growing mountain of evidence that they could no longer ignore or spin. The strike was over, and they had won. The practice of punishing girls for dropping tools or sneezing during their shifts was formally ended. Meals would be improved. Supervisors were warned to change their behavior. This was a crack in the stone wall of class and gender in Britain. These girls had done what others before them could not. They had organized without money, without power, without even formal education. They had built a movement from pain and smoke, lit by matchsticks and carried forward by nothing but their own conviction. And most remarkably, the girls were now permitted to organize. She stepped back. In public, she praised them not as victims, but as leaders. But the tone was different. Supervisors who had once barked orders now hesitated. The girls spoke more freely. Others were promoted to positions of oversight, but none returned with their heads down. Some worked with Annie Besant in theosophical and labor reform circles. The lines between labor rights and women's rights blurred, as they always had, and the Match Girls were walking both. Some disappeared into the tide of working-class life, their moment of glory past, their names forgotten. But they carried the change within them, and what they built together could not be undone. They had tested their worth and found it stronger than anyone believed. Child laborers, factory girls, maids, those long considered powerless, had found a way to resist. Workers could organize. Women could lead. They knew now that if conditions worsened again, they had the ability to fight back. The silence was gone. They are no longer the white slaves of London, she wrote in the link. They are free women who have taught the nation that even the voiceless have power when they speak together. Laws were proposed to limit working hours. Public conversations around workplace safety grew louder. And in 1908, 20 years after the strike, the British government passed the White Phosphorus Prohibition Act, finally banning the substance that had killed and maimed so many. They had taken something hidden, something locked behind factory gates and corporate profit sheets, and dragged it into the light. It had taken too long, far too long. But it happened. But in a world that had never made space for their voices, they had forced history to listen. She showed them what was possible. But long before many of those fights, there were teenage girls in East London, dipping matches into poison, whispering across wooden benches, planning a revolution of their own. She helped organize workers from other factories. Her name doesn't appear in most textbooks, but her legacy remains in every labor law that followed. The Match Girls set up meetings, discussed pay conditions, tracked abuses, and trained new members to speak publicly. It ended in returning to work, in rebuilding lives, in quietly stepping back into daily labor, but now with the knowledge that they were not alone. They had stood up once, and they could stand again. It was bold, grassroots, and practical. The union didn't just exist for strikes, it became a shield, a structure of protection, and a space where working-class women could finally lead. The Times, Pall Mall Gazette, and others covered the victory in breathless detail. Photographers captured grainy black and white images of girls smiling shyly, arms linked, many still wearing patched clothes and work aprons. One photograph shows a group of girls on a bench, their expressions tired but proud. Underneath, the caption read, "Matchmakers triumphant." They would not be punished for speaking together, for meeting after hours, or for representing their collective voice. The victory was not the kind that comes with trumpets or headlines declaring revolution. And so, the girls' demands were met. Unjust fines, the cruel deductions for talking, coughing, or breaking matches were abolished. For the first time in the history of British industrial labor, a group of young working-class women had forced the hand of one of the country's most powerful companies, and they had done it together. The newspapers that had once ignored their existence now ran their photos and printed their names. But it wasn't just about them anymore. This wasn't simply a story of factory girls and phosphorus. Annie Besant, who had stood with them from the beginning, didn't try to claim their moment. Inside the factory, changes came slowly. There was still phosphorus, still danger. Some girls went back to the same stations, dipping, drying, packing. And then came the next great step. They formed a union. The Union of Women Matchmakers became one of Britain's first trade unions run entirely by women. Sarah Chapman, one of the key strike leaders, was among the founding members. Other girls followed suit. They began attending broader labor meetings. Some became involved in the early suffrage movement. But not every girl found an easy path after the strike. Some returned home to families still struggling to eat. Some bore lasting wounds, literal and invisible, from their years around phosphorus. For the industrial world, the strike was a warning. In the years that followed, Britain's labor landscape began to shift. And it happened because of them. The match girls had done what Parliament could not. They had made the suffering visible. They had given it names, faces, voices. They weren't polished or politically trained. They weren't famous. Years later, Annie Besant would look back on the strike, not just as a moment of labor victory, but as a revelation. "It was not I who led them," she once said. "It was they who inspired me." And she meant it. The match girls' story didn't end in confetti or grand parades. They left behind no monuments, but the laws changed. The wages changed. The world began to listen when working women spoke. That is their monument. Today, when we talk about labor movements, about workers' rights, about safety in the workplace, we often think of men in overalls, strikes in coal fields, battles on factory lines. A revolution made not of gunpowder or politics, but of courage, made in smoke and ash. They didn't ask for the world's attention, but they took it. And they didn't win with violence or rage, but with linked arms, clear voices, and the unshakable belief that their lives mattered just as much as anyone else's. That belief burned brighter than phosphorus ever could. The summer of 1888 in London's East End bore witness to an extraordinary act of defiance. Over 1,400 women and girls employed at the Bryant and May match factory courageously walked out, protesting against deplorable working conditions and meager wages. This bold move not only challenged the status quo, but also ignited a transformative movement that would resonate through the annals of labor history. The immediate aftermath of the strike saw the formation of the Union of Women Matchmakers, later known as the Matchmakers Union. This was a groundbreaking development, marking one of the first instances where unskilled female workers organized to demand better conditions. This wave of activism led to significant labor reforms, including the reduction of working hours and the introduction of minimum wage laws. The strike brought this issue to the forefront, prompting public outcry and eventually leading to legislative action. Blacks' efforts further bridged the gap between labor rights and the burgeoning women's suffrage movement, highlighting the interconnectedness of these struggles. In 1908, the British government passed the White Phosphorus Prohibition Act, effectively banning the substance and safeguarding future generations of workers. Their struggle has been depicted in musicals, literature, and films, ensuring that their legacy endures. Their unwavering resolve in the face of adversity laid the groundwork for future movements and reforms. Today, their story continues to inspire and remind us of the profound impact that collective action and solidarity can achieve. In 2022, English Heritage unveiled a blue plaque at the former Bryant and May factory site in Bow, London. This recognition serves as a lasting tribute to their bravery and the indelible mark they left on history. Notably, the 2022 film Enola Holmes 2 featured a fictionalized account of the strike, introducing the narrative to new audiences. Their ability to organize and demand change challenged prevailing notions about women's roles in society. Figures like Sarah Chapman emerged as leaders, demonstrating that women could effectively advocate for their rights and interests. The Match Girls strike demonstrated that collective action could yield tangible results, inspiring countless others to follow suit. The union's establishment was a testament to the Match Girls' resilience and determination to ensure lasting change. Their success served as a catalyst for the new unionism movement, which emphasized the organization of unskilled laborers. The Match Girls' courage in highlighting the dangers they faced daily not only improved their own working conditions, but also set a precedent for occupational health and safety standards. One of the most harrowing aspects of the Match Girls' plight was the prevalence of phossy jaw, a debilitating condition caused by exposure to white phosphorus. This victory underscored the power of grassroots activism in effecting change. Beyond labor reforms, the Match Girls strike had profound implications for the women's rights movement. The strike also influenced prominent activists such as Clementina Black, who campaigned for a legal minimum wage and was involved in the Bryant and May industrial dispute. The Match Girls story has permeated various facets of culture and media. Commemorative efforts have also been undertaken to honor the Match Girls' contributions. The Match Girls strike stands as a seminal moment in the fight for workers' and women's rights. In the quiet flicker of a match, a story unfolds a tale of courage, resilience, and the indomitable spirit of young women who dared to challenge the injustices of their time. The Match Girls strike of 1888 is not merely a historical event. It is a beacon that continues to illuminate the path towards social justice and workers' rights. Their grievances were manifold: meager wages, excessive fines for minor infractions, and the perilous working conditions caused by exposure to white phosphorus, leading to the dreaded phossy jaw. This act of defiance was unprecedented, especially considering the societal norms that expected women to remain silent and submissive. In July 1888, approximately 1,400 women and girls employed at the Bryant and May match factory in Bow, East London, walked out in protest. The strike was not just about better pay or safer working conditions. It was a declaration of agency by women who had long been marginalized. It demonstrated that collective action could yield tangible results, inspiring subsequent movements and contributing to the rise of new unionism in the late 19th century. Their unity and determination challenged the prevailing notions of gender and class, setting a precedent for future labor movements. It challenged societal perceptions of women's capabilities and roles, laying the groundwork for future advancements in women's rights and labor reforms. In 2022, English Heritage unveiled a blue plaque at the former Bryant and May factory site in Bow, acknowledging the historical significance of the strike. Their efforts ensure that the Match Girls story remains a source of inspiration and a testament to the power of collective action. Such commemorations serve not only as tributes to the Match Girls' bravery, but also as reminders of the ongoing struggle for social justice. Their story became emblematic of the struggle for workers' rights, serving as a touchstone for activists and reformers, igniting a small flame, ensuring that their sacrifice and determination continue to inspire and guide us in our pursuit of justice and equality. It symbolizes more than just light. It embodies the enduring spirit of the Match Girls. Their story, no titles, If even a single moment lingered in your mind, I hope you'll take a second to support this channel. Like this video, subscribe for more journeys into forgotten corners of history, and share this with someone who still believes in quiet strength. No power, but they had each other. And that was enough. Until next time, may we all remember the light that once came from the smallest flame, forged in the fires of adversity, continues to illuminate the path toward a more equitable and compassionate society. The strike's legacy is evident in the improved labor standards and the broader recognition of women's contributions to social movements. The strike's success underscored the potential of organized labor, particularly among marginalized groups, to effect meaningful change. We reached the end of our journey through smoke-filled rooms, clattering machines, and the quiet courage of girls who refused to stay silent. The Matchstick girls lit more than just the lamps of London. In their small, calloused hands, they carried the spark of change flickering against injustice, glowing through darkness, and leaving behind a flame that still burns in the hearts of those who remember. It calls upon us to support those who continue to fight for fair treatment, safe working conditions, and equal opportunities. The Match Girls' courage exemplifies the transformative potential of collective action, inspiring current and future generations to advocate for justice. Her article, White Slavery in London, published in The Link on June 23, 1888, exposed the harsh realities faced by the workers. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Your presence here matters. Besant's advocacy provided the Match Girls with a platform, amplifying their voices and garnering public sympathy. The involvement of social reformer Annie Besant was instrumental in bringing the plight of the Match Girls to public attention. Her support lent credibility to the workers' cause and highlighted the importance of allyship in social movements. In an era where workers' rights and gender equality remain pressing issues, the Match Girls' story serves as a powerful reminder of what can be achieved through unity and determination. Besant's collaboration with the Match Girls exemplifies the power of solidarity across different strata of society, and the establishment of a separate dining area to prevent contamination from phosphorus. Moreover, the strike led to the formation of the Union of Women Matchmakers, one of the first trade unions for unskilled women workers in Britain. The strike concluded with significant concessions from the factory management, the abolition of unjust fines, improved working conditions. This victory was not just a triumph for the Match Girls, but a watershed moment in labor history. The impact of the Match Girls' strike reverberated beyond the immediate gains. In the years that followed, the Match Girls' courage continued to inspire. Efforts to honor the Match Girls have taken various forms, from literature and theater to public memorials. The Match Girls Memorial, a charitable organization, continues to promote the legacy of the strike through education and community events. The Match Girls strike offers enduring lessons on the importance of solidarity, the impact of grassroots activism, and the necessity of challenging systemic injustices. Their legacy encourages us to recognize and confront the inequities that persist in our societies. Each time a match is struck, let us carry forward the torch they lit. And so, they had no riches if this story moved you. Leave us a comment below. What part of the Match Girls story struck you the most? And if you haven't already, thank you for walking with us through the shadows. Good night.